She healed the pain he thought he'd carry forever, and he became the strength she never knew she needed. The first time he noticed her, it wasn't dramatic. She didn't burst into the room or command attention with force. She simply existed, graceful and quietly present, like a melody half-heard but lingering in the memory. He was sitting alone at a corner cafe, nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring at the faint scuffs on the wooden table, lost in the haze of thoughts he couldn't quite untangle. His mind wandered to the fractures of his past, disappointments, the quiet loneliness of nights spent replaying failures, moments of longing he had learned to swallow. There was a hollowness he carried with him, invisible yet heavy, like a shadow clinging to the edges of his life. She entered the space with that calm authority only experience can give. Her steps were measured, yet soft, the kind that seemed to leave no mark but somehow commanded awareness. Her eyes, warm, observing, hinting at the story she held in quiet confidence, glanced around the room before settling briefly on him. That fleeting connection, a brush of recognition in her gaze, made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. There was something familiar, yet foreign, as if she had appeared from a place he had only dared to dream existed. He studied her without intending to. There was a light in the way she carried herself, the subtle sway of her shoulders, the gentle curve of her smile when she interacted with the barista. She moved with a kind of ease he envied, a grace he had long forgotten about in himself. And yet, beneath it, he sensed a quiet vulnerability, a hidden softness behind the confident mask, a fleeting sadness that she wore like a second skin, delicate and almost imperceptible, tugged at the corner of his awareness. He realized, almost instinctively, that she, too, carried wounds she didn't broadcast, a truth mirrored in his own reflection of hurt. For her part, she noticed him too, not in a calculating or intentional way, but like one notices the faint hum of a familiar song in a crowded room. He seemed contained, observing everything yet revealing nothing, a quiet tension that spoke of past pains he had yet to reconcile. Her curiosity stirred, not from attraction in the shallow sense, but from a recognition of kindred struggle. There was an honesty in his posture, in the small lines of worry around his eyes, that invited empathy rather than judgment. Their first encounter was brief, almost inconsequential in action, a shared smile across a crowded cafe, the soft brush of hands as she picked up a dropped napkin, but it carried a weight neither fully understood. It was a moment suspended in quiet awareness, where both of them felt the strange, subtle tug of someone who might see them without asking them to hide. In that fleeting instant, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, that perhaps, unknowingly, they had begun to inhabit the same emotional space. A space where pain could exist without shame, and where, for the first time in a long time, being seen felt safe. By the time she walked away, the lingering impression of her presence weighed on him like sunlight pressing through a fogged window, warm, intangible, and impossible to ignore. He didn't know her yet. He didn't know what she could mean for his life. But a part of him, the part that had longed for connection in the quiet hours, felt a fragile, hesitant flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this encounter might matter. The second time they crossed paths, it wasn't planned, yet it felt inevitable. Life has a strange way of nudging people together when they need each other most, even before they realize it. He was walking down a narrow street lined with small bookstores, the autumn air crisp and slightly fragrant with damp leaves, when she appeared around the corner. She was balancing a stack of papers in a tote bag that seemed far too heavy for one person. In a heartbeat, a gust of wind sent one of the papers tumbling across the pavement. He reacted before thinking, lunging to catch at midair. Their hands brushed, brief, almost incidental, but the contact lingered in his mind far longer than it should have. She looked up at him with a start, and then a smile that was equal parts gratitude and amusement. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm but quiet, carrying a subtle musicality that made him pause. He handed her the paper, feeling the softness of her fingers as they met his for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of touch that felt like an unspoken question, a gentle invitation without words. They walked together for a few steps, awkwardly at first, each hesitant to speak more than necessary. Yet the silence was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like the spaces between musical notes that make the melody meaningful. He found himself observing the way she adjusted the strap of her bag, the slight crease of concern on her brow that didn't quite reach her eyes, the careful way she navigated the uneven pavement. She, in turn, noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to measure each word before speaking, as if guarding his thoughts from the world. A conversation began naturally, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. She asked him something simple about the bookstore they were passing, and he found himself answering honestly, more honestly than he had spoken to anyone in months. It was easy, and yet there was a quiet gravity beneath it, a sense that both were choosing to reveal themselves in tiny increments, without knowing why. For him, this brief interaction stirred something long dormant. Recognition that connection did not have to be loud, dramatic, or immediate. It could be quiet, measured, and still profoundly moving. For her, it was the first flicker of curiosity that she might have found someone who didn't just see her surface, who could perhaps recognize the weight she carried in her own subtle ways. The most striking part of that encounter wasn't the words exchanged, but the small, lingering touches. The brush of their hands when she steadied the papers, the slight shift closer when the wind threatened to topple her bag again. Every movement carried warmth, a shared human rhythm that neither of them could ignore. They parted shortly after, but the imprint of that interaction stayed with him. The way her presence seemed to fill the spaces his pain had carved out, the quiet assurance that perhaps someone else could notice without demanding, could care without forcing. By the time he walked away, he realized he was smiling to himself, a small, involuntary curve of lips that hadn't appeared in weeks. And he knew, without fully understanding why, that this accidental connection was no longer accidental. Something had begun, delicate and fragile, yet potent enough to stir hope where there had been none before. After that first accidental connection, the encounters began to feel less like coincidence and more like quiet destiny. He found himself seeking her presence, not out of obligation, but because there was a gentle ease in being around her that he hadn't realized he was craving. She, too, seemed to notice his absence when they didn't cross paths, the faint crease of concern on her brow betraying a growing attachment she hadn't expected. Their meetings were small, often unplanned. A shared coffee in a quiet cafe, a conversation outside a bookstore, or a spontaneous walk through a park where the leaves were just beginning to turn. Each meeting unfolded slowly, like the turning of a page in a favorite book, with moments that were almost mundane, yet charged with subtle intimacy. He began to talk more than he thought possible, revealing small fragments of his life that had long been sealed away. She listened, genuinely, with that rare kind of attention that makes the world fall away. The slight tilt of her head, the gentle nod, the way her eyes softened whenever he shared a truth he had hidden even from himself. Her presence was like sunlight filtering through a fogged window, warm, steady, and illuminating spaces he hadn't known were dark. In return, she began to share pieces of herself too, not burdensome confessions, but quiet truths that hinted at her own vulnerabilities. A past disappointment, a fear she hadn't voiced aloud, a fleeting insecurity about a choice she had made years ago. There was a grace in the way she offered these glimpses, a balance of strength and openness that invited trust without pressure. He found himself inspired by it, willing to meet her honesty with his own, letting walls crumble just enough to allow connection. The emotional healing began, not in grand gestures, but in the small, almost imperceptible acts of care. He would notice if she looked tired and offer to carry her tote for a few blocks, or adjust her scarf when the wind blew too sharply. She would laugh quietly at the way he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, teasing him gently, but with affection. They shared glances that lingered just a moment too long, hands that nearly touched, while pointing out a book title or a leaf caught in the wind. Each fleeting touch, each shared laugh, each comfortable silence was a tiny stitch in a tapestry of trust and healing. He realized that in her company, the ache he carried from old wounds softened, not vanished but soothed. Her presence acted like a balm, quieting the persistent ache of loneliness, making him feel lighter, more alive, more seen. She, in turn, noticed a steadiness in him that she hadn't before, a subtle patience, a groundedness, a capacity for care that was awakening something she had long thought dormant in herself. Together, they were creating a space where vulnerability was safe and emotional repair was possible. By the end of these shared moments, the subtle romantic tension began to hum beneath the surface. It wasn't in words, not yet. It was in the lingering gaze, the brush of hands, the unspoken understanding and silences that stretched comfortably between them. They were beginning to see not only each other's pain, but the potential for something more, a bond built on quiet trust, gentle healing, and the slow, deliberate discovery of one another. By now, their bond had begun to settle into something comfortable yet quietly charged, a rhythm that neither of them had expected but both secretly cherished. The small, accidental meetings had evolved into moments that felt intentional, even if neither admitted it aloud. He began noticing the finer details, the way her fingers lingered on the rim of her coffee cup, the soft catch in her breath when a memory surfaced, the faint crease between her brows when she was thinking deeply. She, in turn, studied him carefully, recognizing the subtle tells of his emotions, the way his jaw tightened when he tried to hide a worry, the small sigh that escaped when he allowed himself to relax in her presence. The first cracks in the walls he had so carefully built came during one of their quiet afternoons in the park. The sky was a gentle shade of gray, clouds moving lazily, and the air held the crisp scent of early winter. They were sitting on a bench, the sound of rustling leaves and distant children's laughter forming a soft backdrop. She spoke of a past disappointment, a decision that hadn't gone as she had hoped, a regret she had tucked away because admitting it felt too vulnerable. Her voice was steady, yet he could hear the tremor beneath the surface, the hidden ache that she didn't broadcast to the world. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to fix it. Instead, he simply listened, letting her words land and echo without interruption. And in that quiet space, he found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. He spoke of the moments he had carried alone, the guilt, the loneliness, the nights he had spent replaying mistakes. It was uncomfortable, exposing truths he had buried, yet the act of sharing it with her felt strangely liberating. He realized that vulnerability was no longer a threat but a bridge, and she was the first person he had met who would walk across it with him. There were subtle touches that accompanied this emotional opening. Her hand briefly brushing his as she gestured, a reassuring nudge of her shoulder against his, the faint warmth that lingered whenever their arms accidentally met. Each contact was careful, respectful, yet it carried a quiet intimacy that neither could deny. The tension in the air wasn't anxious. It was anticipatory, a slow-burning awareness of closeness that words couldn't fully capture. For her, seeing him reveal his vulnerabilities awakened something protective and tender. She felt a deep admiration for his courage, tempered by a growing awareness of her own feelings. It wasn't about physical attraction. It was about trust, safety, and the recognition of a soul that mirrored her own in its longing for connection. She responded not with pressure, but with quiet reassurance. A look that lingered just a second too long, a gentle hand resting lightly near his during moments of pause, an unspoken message that he was seen, valued, and not alone. By the end of this afternoon, the balance had shifted. The distance that had once existed between them, maintained by unspoken walls, had softened. Each had let down pieces of their defenses, discovering that vulnerability could be met with care rather than judgment. It was a turning point. Their emotional intimacy deepened, and the slow, simmering tension between them began to hum beneath the surface. They were learning, slowly but surely, That connection was not a forceful act, but a quiet, deliberate weaving together of lives and hearts, thread by delicate thread. By now, the bond between them had deepened beyond casual conversation or quiet companionship. Their shared moments had become anchors in each other's lives, a gentle predictability that neither had expected but both had begun to depend on. And yet, beneath the warmth of familiarity, a quiet tension had begun to stir, subtle but persistent, like the first whisper of wind before a storm. They were both aware of it, though neither admitted it aloud. It was during one ordinary afternoon, the kind that could have passed unnoticed in another life, that the shift became undeniable. He noticed her struggling with a stack of documents, the corner of her lips pressed together in concentration. Without thinking, he stepped closer, instinctively offering to help. Their hands met as they arranged the papers, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. There was a charged pause, an unspoken acknowledgement of something deeper simmering beneath the surface. She caught his gaze and held it, her eyes softening, a subtle warmth radiating from her expression. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. Recognition of his care, of his attentiveness, and perhaps, she thought, of feelings that had quietly grown over time. For him, the realization came in a rush. He was no longer simply drawn to her presence, no longer content with companionship alone. His chest tightened at the thought of her absence, his mind tracing every curve of her smile, the quiet confidence in her posture, the gentleness she exuded even in small, unremarkable actions. The moment wasn't dramatic, and yet it carried a gravity that left them both breathless. He felt a protective surge, a desire to be close, to be needed, to be someone she could rely on, not just for small favors, but for her emotional safety, her quiet moments of doubt. She, in turn, noticed the change in him, the way his focus seemed entirely hers, the slight hesitation in his movements, the carefulness in his voice when he spoke directly to her. She realized that she, too, was feeling a pull she hadn't anticipated, a longing for closeness that went beyond friendship. Even so, the awareness of their age difference, the careful respect they held for one another, kept them restrained. Desire was present, undeniable, yet tempered with patience, understanding, and an almost reverent caution. They moved through the tension slowly, savoring each shared glance, each brush of hands, each small, intentional proximity. A shared laugh, the soft warmth of his hand near hers on the table, the subtle lean of her shoulder toward him, all became loaded with meaning without a single word being spoken. It was in these quiet, suspended moments that both of them understood the truth. They wanted more than companionship, more than trust. They wanted each other, in ways that had little to do with physical attraction and everything to do with emotional resonance. And yet, the desire was silent, simmering, a tension they carried with grace, careful not to rush, knowing that the slow unfolding of their feelings was part of what made the connection profound. By the end of the day, the realization had settled into them both, a quiet, electric certainty. They were not just healing each other. They were awakening to something deeper, a mutual longing that neither had sought but both had inevitably found. The emotional peak was not in a declaration, a kiss, or a dramatic moment. It was in the awareness, the charge in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that their connection had crossed a line from comfort into desire. And it was beautiful, patient, and painfully, irresistibly alive. After the quiet realization of desire, their relationship began to transform from tentative connection to something more grounded, something stronger. The emotional tension that had hummed beneath the surface gave way to a shared understanding. They were no longer just two people healing from past wounds. They were becoming anchors for one another. The shift wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone outside their world, but monumental to them. It began with small gestures, each one carrying weight far beyond its simplicity. He noticed the strain in her expression during a particularly stressful day and offered his support without being asked. standing by her side as she navigated challenges, listening with patience when the weight of her responsibilities threatened to overwhelm her. He didn't solve her problems. He simply offered his presence, a steady hand, a listening ear. In return, she continued to nurture the quiet healing he had begun to experience. Her words were measured, warm, and empathetic, reminding him that his pain, though heavy, was not permanent. Her laughter, soft and genuine, acted as a balm to his frayed nerves, her encouragement a gentle push toward hope and self-acceptance. Their physical interactions mirrored this emotional grounding. It was in the little things, a hand resting lightly on his shoulder when he looked uncertain, his fingers brushing against hers as they walked side by side, the quiet proximity of sitting close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. There was no rush, no need for grand gestures. Every touch, every glance, every shared silence became a wordless conversation, a reassurance that they were becoming indispensable to one another. One pivotal moment crystallized this mutual strength. Perhaps it was a minor crisis, a personal challenge for her, an emotional setback for him. But in facing it together, they realized the depth of their bond. He offered support with calm certainty, a quiet strength that reassured her even when she doubted herself. She responded with vulnerability, allowing him to see her fears, and in doing so, she gave him a chance to rise as a source of stability and protection. They didn't simply comfort one another. They lifted each other, filling in the gaps where life had once left holes of loneliness and pain. This turning point also marked a deeper emotional intimacy. They had moved past the initial awkwardness of vulnerability into a space where they could rely on one another without hesitation. Trust had become second nature, and with it came freedom, the freedom to be fully themselves without masks or pretenses. They could laugh, sit in silence, or share small, mundane moments and feel profoundly connected. The romantic tension that had simmered subtly now existed alongside a deep, abiding sense of companionship. By the end of this period, they were no longer two separate people carrying their own burdens. They had begun to merge their lives emotionally. He had become her strength, calm and steady when the world felt overwhelming. She had healed his pain, teaching him that trust, warmth, and genuine care could exist without complication or fear. Together, they were discovering a rhythm, a balance, a mutual support system that felt like home. And in that delicate, intentional closeness, they knew that they had found something rare, a love rooted not just in desire, but in the quiet, sustaining power of mutual healing and unwavering presence. By the time they reached this point, the distance that once existed between them, built from hesitation, past pain, and unspoken fears, had almost entirely vanished. What remained was a quiet, unshakable bond, one forged not by grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but by the steady accumulation of shared moments, trust, and emotional honesty. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, had offered and received support, and had gradually come to understand a profound truth. They were better together than apart. Their connection had matured into something deeper than desire alone. It was the comfort of knowing someone could hold your weight without judgment, the quiet joy of laughter shared over mundane things, and the subtle reassurance in every glance that said, "I see you, and I choose you." For him, it was the realization that the emptiness he had carried for years could be filled, not entirely, for wounds linger, but by her presence, her empathy, and her unwavering acceptance. For her, it was understanding that her strength was amplified by his steadiness, his attentiveness, and his quiet devotion. They had become each other's sanctuary, a place where pain could be softened and joy amplified. The culmination of their journey came not in a single moment, but in a series of small, deliberate choices. They met on a crisp evening in a park they had wandered together countless times. The sun was low, casting golden light over the path, and the air carried the faint scent of winter approaching. They walked side by side, hands brushing occasionally, until their fingers finally intertwined, a natural, unforced act that felt like the inevitable conclusion of months of emotional discovery. Neither spoke because words weren't needed. The warmth of their touch, the shared rhythm of their steps, and the quiet smiles on their faces spoke volumes. Sitting on their favorite bench, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. The simplicity of the gesture, no grand flourish, no declaration, held a depth of intimacy that words could not convey. He responded instinctively, draping an arm lightly around her, feeling the subtle steadiness of her heartbeat against his chest. In that quiet embrace, both recognized the full scope of what had developed between them, a love rooted in respect, understanding, and the delicate interweaving of their lives and hearts. The unspoken romantic tension that had simmered beneath the surface since their first accidental meeting had transformed into a soft, enduring warmth. Every glance, every laugh, every shared silence was now layered with meaning, a testament to the patience, trust, and care that had defined their slow-burn journey. Age, past wounds, and fear of vulnerability no longer mattered. What mattered was the connection they had cultivated, a connection strong enough to withstand life's uncertainties. As they rose to leave, walking side by side under the soft evening light, there was a shared sense of completion and hope. They had healed each other in ways neither could have anticipated, and in the process, discovered that love was not about rushing, nor about grand gestures, but about being present, steady, and unwavering. Together, they had created a sanctuary of mutual strength and quiet devotion, a love story that was tender, YouTube-safe, and emotionally resonant, one that would linger in the hearts of anyone who witnessed it.